In this tutorial, I will teach you how you can create a tower or an enemy which reacts and shoots at player only when the player is visible. Something like that. Pew! Well, something like that, but without these nice sound effects. Those are proprietary.
Functionality like this is often used in games where you have enemies which need to detect you and chase you and shoot at you only when you are clearly visible.
So that is a game. On the right, I have a tower, and this tower is supposed to catch and kill my player. On the left, I have a player, and there is the wall between them. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to teach my tower to detect when the player is visible and attack player as soon as the player visible. Right now, my player can just move left and right, nothing special. And even if my player is clearly visible, tower is just ignoring the player. So let's see what I have in the game. So obviously I have a room, I have 4 objects: wall, tower, player, and a bullet. Now what we need to do first is to go to our tower object and create a step event. And also create a create event. I usually use create event for object initialization like a constructor, and I believe this is intended use for the create event anyways. So here let's create a variable, let's call it player is visible, and let's make it false by default. Now in the step event, that's where we're going to determine if player is visible. To determine if player is visible, we are going to draw an invisible line between the player and tower, something like that. This is the wall, this is our tower, and this is going to be our player. So what we need to do, we need to check that on this line between the tower and the player, if there is any time a collision with the wall. And to check this condition in GameMaker, there is a very helpful function, luckily, called collision line. I didn't know that, and in one of my previous games I had to do this like the hard way. Don't repeat my mistakes, use the collision line for this sort of thing. So let's see how I use the collision line in this particular case. First, I specified 2 points between the tower and the player. Since it is the tower step event, first I'm referencing the tower X and Y, so self X, self Y, and second the object player where I'm targeting. Object player X and object player Y. Then I specify the object I would like to check the collision with. It is object wall, and then I have 2 interesting parameters, false and true. Let me explain those in more details. So if you go to the collision line function, you see there are 2 Boolean parameters. First is the precision. Precision means that we're going to use the precise bounding box or precise sprite-based bounding box. This is usually slower, and in our particular case, with a rectangular wall, it doesn't really matter. Also for the collision, when you use not precise shape, it kind of gives a player a bit of an edge. So let's see here. So the bounding box for the player would be the square area where the player lies. And when you use bounding box instead of a precise collision check, it kind of gives a player a bit of an edge, it makes a player a bit less visible, which in many games is what you actually want, to give a player a bit of a slack. And the second is not me, which means to exclude the self, the instance which is calling the collision line function, which is the tower in my case, from the collision check. It is helpful when you provide more than one object for checking for the collision, and you can see that in the object parameter you can provide tile map element, you can provide object, instance, and even array of instances. Next thing is pay attention to X and Y of the sprite. Those are origin points. By default, those are top left of the sprite, so here and here, which not always ideal. So in many cases, I tend to put X and Y in the middle of the sprite. So it's going to be here and here, which I believe more like what we want. So let's do that. I'm going to the sprite player, properties, and here it is, origin. Just check middle center. Do the same for tower. Origin, middle center. So now when we have this check for the visible player, for player visibility, we need to change the behavior of the tower. It should start shooting. So if player is visible, I'm checking for it here, and if the player is visible, I'm calling the shoot function. Now this shoot function is defined in object tower create event. Let's check it out. Here it is. What we do, we use the function point direction to get the direction towards the player, which returns a vector, and it uses the same idea. I provide x and y, which again self x and y in this case because it's object tower, and then object player x and y, and that returns me the vector direction. Then I create an instance of a bullet at the x and y, so at the same location as my tower now, and I put it to the instances layer. Finally, for this created object bullet, I add direction and I add speed. And why it's cool is because when you have direction and speed, you can create movement, or actually GameMaker moves the object automatically without you needing to change X and Y, which at some point I didn't know about GameMaker. It's a really cool feature, check it out. And finally, in the object bullet itself, all I do is I'm checking for the collision using the place meeting with the player, wall, and when the object bullet is out of the room. Finally, let's check out the results we got. Here's my game. Here's my player, and here's my wall. Let me move. And as soon as my tower sees the player, it starts shooting. But then, should I disappear? It stops shooting. So this is the end of this tutorial. In the next tutorial, what we're gonna do, we're going to add a range for our tower, so tower doesn't shoot at you unless you're close enough for the tower range. And there are again more than one way to achieve that, and which one to use, probably up to you. See you around in the next tutorial.